Today we're going to be taking a look at the artwork of Hanson Puthoff, an early California Impressionist, and how he achieved atmospheric perspective in his paintings. That feeling of being able to step into the painting and walk back into the distance. Hanson Puthoff was born in 1875 and died in 1972. And he was born in a little town called Waverly, Missouri, known for its apple orchards. It's in western Missouri, and it's about 10 miles from the little town my family is from. So we claim Hanson Puthoff as a Missouri artist. I think he left Waverly before he could speak, but still, he was born there. So we consider him a native Missourian. Now, he ended up going to the Art Institute of Chicago and then an art school in Colorado before ending up in California, where he's known as one of the best early California Impressionists during the early and mid 20th century. And what I always liked about his paintings more than anything else is that feeling of depth in his paintings, that you could walk into his paintings and keep going for miles. He was really able to capture that sense of depth and distance in his painting. And that's the problem we have as painters. Our canvas or board or paper is flat. It's two-dimensional. So how do we create that illusion of depth in our paintings, like you could step into them and walk for miles? And I want to focus on that. I have two things we're going to look at. One is value relationships, and one is color temperature relationships. Now there's more, there's edges and color intensity, but I want to focus mainly on these two because I think they're the main things you have to know first before moving on maybe to edges. But value-wise, value relationships, we want the values to change as there's more distance going back. And I tend to break the landscape up into layers. This one, you can break it up into three. You got the foreground layer of the trees. In the foreground, the shadow and sunlight. In the middle ground here, the flat plain with the grass and trees in the middle ground. And then the background would be the mountains. So 3, 4 layers, and then progressively, each of those layers have to get lighter in value and cooler in color. And that's the key. Despite what we're seeing in a reference, or what you're seeing if you're outside even, but especially a reference, if you're painting from a reference, typically the photograph is not going to capture like it really is out there as far as temperature goes, or even value. The values are generally wrong in a photograph. So you have to understand what you're trying to achieve and how to do it, and then push it, because you can't copy what's there. So value-wise, we're talking about darks and lights. The shadows in these foreground trees are going to be a lot darker than the shadows in the middle ground, and they're going to be a lot darker than the shadows in the background. Fairly simple. Same thing with the color. And again, we're talking color temperature. The sunlit lights on the trees in the foreground and on the grass is going to be a lot more intense. It's going to be warmer. Then back in here, these warm colors are a little less warm. They're still sunlit looking. There's still warmth there in the sunlight, but a little less, not quite as warm as the foreground. And then in the background, they're barely warm at all in the sunlight and really cool in the shadows. You can see the shadows in the foreground trees are a lot warmer than the shadows in the background mountains. Now these shadows in the foreground trees are cool compared to the sunlight, but they're really warm, especially the orange shadow is really warm compared to the background mountains. By the time you get this far, into the mountains here, it's going to be just a muted blue. You're not going to see much color at all because yellow drops out first. You can see the yellow start to fade in the middle ground. And by the time you get to these shadows back in here, there's no yellow at all. Now, there's still some yellow in the sunlight because there is sun hitting the slopes on the mountains, but that warmth is knocked down. It's cooled quite a bit. I see this as a violet, this sunlit mountain. Now, you could just say gray if you want, but we want to think in terms of color. So if I see that color, to me that looks like a grayed violet. So instead of thinking gray, I think in terms of color. But it's cool, so I have to add maybe a touch of yellow or orange to it to make it look sunlit, but not nearly as much as the middle ground or the foreground, because there's still sunlight in those background hills, but I have to keep the relationship right between the middle ground and foreground. And that's the key word in both the value and the color temperature is relationship. So thinking about value right now, if I look at the shadow on these mountains, they're dark or light compared to what's around it. So I can't just isolate that shadow in a photograph or outside if I'm painting outside and just try and match what I see. I have to look at this shadow in the mountains and compare it to the sunlight on the mountains. And that difference between the two is what I'm after. These shadows are only dark compared to how light the lights are. Same thing with the lights on the mountain. I compare it to maybe the shadow in the clouds. There's not a lot of difference there value-wise, but some. Same thing with the sunlight and shadow on this foreground orange tree. I can see how light these lights are by looking at the shadow. And that's called comparing the values. If you don't compare, if I just look at this dark orange on this foreground tree and I mix my color until I think I match it, I'm always going to be wrong, value-wise. So I have to compare that with something else. So for these dark trees, the shadow up here, I'm going to stare at the clouds. And out of my peripheral vision, I'll see how much darker the shadow is. So you're comparing. Everything is dark or light compared to what's around it. And that's really key, because if you isolate and just try and match what you see, you're always going to be wrong. I mean, you might, 1 times out of 100 get it right because you're guessing. But if you're not comparing, you're usually going to get it wrong. Looking at this here, this one, again, if we get rid of the color, you can see the value difference, the shadows in the trees up front and the shadows on the mountains. And if you get that right relationship between the shadows back here and the shadows up here, you're going to get that feeling of depth. And then generally the shadows of the trees in the middle are also in between these two. Now these are a little lighter because it's fall and these trees are a little lighter color. So they're not going to read. These are lighter trees and color. So the shadows are still a little lighter than the background mountain shadows, but not much. That does lose a little depth because these are darker. But still, the overall feeling of lighter shadows in the background, darker in the foreground holds up really well. And then temperature-wise, all of these colors up front are saturated and warm. Even though the shadows are cool, in like this tree here, it's still a little warmer than the shadow in the background. Even in the shadows tend to be warmer in the foreground and cooler the further away they get. Now this one, all the colors are slightly muted, and you can see there's more violets and everything in the background, more blue in the shadow in the background mountains and more violet in the sunlit areas. Now it's a warm violet. He's adding some yellows or oranges to the violet or gray to make it a warm violet, but it's still cooler than these colors up front. And when we think of color temperature, we're thinking of, the color wheel and basically 2 colors. Blue is the coolest color on the color wheel, and then yellow is the warmest. So all the warm colors have a little bit of yellow in it. All the cool colors have blue in it. And you can see, even though there's orange in the background mountain, there is some violet or blue violet in that color. And that makes it go back and recede from this orange. Even in the shadow here, this orange is a lot stronger. And in the shadows in the mountains way far away, they're basically going to turn more just a muted blue. So the orange drops out of the shadow in the mountain, and I'm just left with kind of a muted blue, a little stronger blue here, but it's bluer, a lot lighter and a lot bluer than the shadows up front. And again, it's a relationship. This is light or dark compared to the values around it. So don't forget to compare. Now this one doesn't have sunlight in it, but still you can see the colors in the foreground are a lot more saturated. They're stronger colors. And then a bit more violets added to the greens back in here. Of course, the trees are more of a greenish color. Looks like maybe a drought in the summer, and they get kind of more of a violet look to the greens. And then in the distance, it's mostly violet with just a little bit of local color. So the greens way in the distance have a lot more blue or blue violet in them. The red rocks have a lot of violet or blue in them. But not so in the foreground, really saturated, a lot stronger. And then the values too. Darker up front, that's the darkest darks. And then the darks gradually get lighter as they go back. And you're not always going to see it right. And you have to create that difference between the dark and the light and the warm and the cool. You have to create it and push it to make it work on your painting. Because our surface is flat. And if we get too subtle with those differences between the value and the color temperature, it's just not going to work. And I tend to push it more than what I see, because when I push it more, it's actually closer to what's there. Our eyes don't usually compare really well. We have to push it more than what we see, and it comes up working better. I also have to keep my color fairly thick. I might start out thin and get everything blocked in and get the value and color relationships close to what I want, but then I go back and get thicker paint in the lights, because thicker paint in the light areas is going to have more impact. It's going to look lighter, it's going to look brighter. You're going to get more truer color with thick paint. Real thin paint loses color intensity, it can lose its value. So keep your paint a lot thicker than thinner. Now I do keep the darks thinner, but still you can see it in here, his darks are at least thick enough that you can see the color. You add too much paint thinner or too much medium, you're going to lose the color intensity and lose the value. Now he has the foreground and shadow here. So the foreground is actually a little cooler because it's in shadow. But if we look at this foreground area and compare it to the green back here, there's quite a difference in intensity of color, and it's a little bit cooler. It's not as warm. It's still sunlit back in here, but this is a lot warmer, a lot stronger. Adding a little bit of blue violet in everything till he has a lot of blue violet back in here. Warmed up with a little bit of orange, so it looks sunlit, but it's cool. It stays back in the distance. And what creates that atmosphere is the moisture in the air. You're looking through moisture and it's making the colors cooler and the shadows a little lighter. And the more moisture you have, the more atmospheric perspective. So if you're painting in the Southwest, you're not going to have as much atmospheric perspective. Things are going to be more clear. You still have temperature change and value change as things recede. Not as much as like in California or on the East Coast. You get a lot more atmosphere. Here again, the foreground is in shadow, background is in sunlight, but darks are a lot darker. We get rid of the color. Darks are a lot darker in the foreground. You can see here on the left side, a lot lighter in the background. So push that difference value-wise. Then temperature-wise, there is a lot of warmth in the background here because the foreground is in shadow. So this is the anomaly. It's not going to work as well because the foreground is in a cast shadow. But the foreground shadows and colors are a lot stronger and warmer than the background shadows. See, the background shadows are a muted blue. Here you have stronger colors that are warmer than blue because they're in the foreground. Again, you can just feel these background mountains. While there's green in it and orange in the background mountains, it's affected by the blue-violet. So you can almost block in this mountain, make it one big, slightly muted violet color or blue-violet. Then into that, you could scrub the orange and the green, and it'll sink into that violet and keep it in the distance. The stronger, warmer color here in the tree, a little more muted in the middle ground, and a lot muted and cooler in the background. This one's kind of backlit. You can see the values receding, going back. You can almost paint all the mountains, again, blue first, and then paint into the blue with the green, and that blue will hold the green back into the distance. Then you get more violet in the middle ground, because violet has red in it, starting to warm up a little bit, and then you have more yellows and oranges in the foreground. Now you could have orange in the very background mountain, you know, a big orange rock, but it's going to be so affected by blue, blue-violet, violet, that it'll stay back in the distance. So everything is affected in the distance with a bluish color to make it recede. Here's another one. Again, see how warm and strong these colors are in front. Darks, really dark. I mean, it really hits that very, very dark. And that relationship between this dark tree and these values in the shadow back in here is quite a bit. These are dark, but not nearly as dark as that. And that pushes the distance between them. So get that relationship. We all think it's about the color. If I can just match the color I see, but it's not. It's about getting the right value relationships between the layers in your painting to create that depth. Because color-wise, I can make these hills, the grass, the trees, any color I want, but it's the value relationships between them that's going to matter, and the temperature. This foreground has to be a lot warmer than the colors in the background. So get used to pushing things a lot more than what you think to create that feeling of depth in there. I got a few of mine. And this one, temperature-wise, everything's getting bluer as it gets back until in the background, I've got shadow snow, which is mostly blue, and then the sunlit snow, which is kind of a muted, it's a real pale orange is what it is. But so much white. White is cool. So I just warmed up the white just slightly. Too much orange or yellow in that white to make it look sunlit would bring it forward. But the strongest yellows are in front, and the yellows in the middle ground are a lot weaker, and the yellows don't show up in the background. Yellow is the first color to drop out as your subject recedes into the distance. Now these are all aspens back in here, so it still shows, but they're more muted in the foreground. And that's the key, is to get that right relationship. If I get these really strong, then it'll be easier to mute these and get them a little cooler and push them back. I generally add a touch of real light violet to the light yellow, and that's going to cool it off. It's going to gray it. I don't add, let me get back to this one. I don't add blue to the yellow in the distance because it'll just turn green. But violet will mute it slightly and cool it off a little bit. This one, of course, the shadow is in the foreground. So the background sunlit mountain is going to look warmer than the foreground because the foreground is all in shadow. But if the shadow wasn't here, I would have a lot stronger, more saturated color. But the reason it works is because the darks are so dark. So it's the value in this one that makes the trees come forward and the mountains go back. It's not the color temperature because of that big cast shadow on the foreground. It makes all of these colors cool. But if you notice the warmer colors that are in the shadow, you got orange here and some red, red-orange here in the foreground as well. Even the green on the grass that's in shadow, it's a lot warmer than these background shadows. So foreground shadows compared to the background have to be a bit warmer for it to hold up. But the value difference between the shadow on these trees and the shadow on the mountain is pretty strong, that contrast. The more I can push that, the more depth I'm going to have Here it's a lot of yellow in the foreground, and there are really no aspens in the background, so the foreground's going to come forward. And I'm really going to mute. I added violet to these green pine trees in the distance. And that violet, they still look green somewhat, and that violet pushes them back into the distance. And nothing this warm in the background as the strong yellow, sunlit yellow, or even in the shadow, yellow, yellow-orange. That's all real warm and comes forward. And these darks in these pine trees are what keeps everything up front in the foreground. And the lighter shadows in the background makes them stay back in the distance. So really focus on the difference between the two. It's a little color study. The darkness in these pine trees and then the real light shadow on the mountain creates that depth. Then the stronger, warmer color in the greenery and the yellow ochre, in the foreground grasses and shrubbery, compared to the same colors in the middle ground, creates that depth there. Gradually adding a little blue violet to everything in the background. This lighter area here of kind of dirt and grass on the mountain, added violet to that, or blue violet, to make it stay back there. Otherwise, it's just an orange, and it wouldn't stay back in the distance. Another one here, the foreground has more detail. The yellow is a lot stronger in the foreground. The yellows back in here just have a bit more white added to them, maybe a little bit of violet, but more white. As you can see in the shadow too, the shadow in these foreground aspens is a lot warmer than the shadow on the yellow grass in the middle ground. So I usually want to compare shadow with shadow. So the foreground shadow warmer than the background shadow or middle ground shadow. Then the shadows back in here are just a violet. No other color thrown in there. It's just more simple because it's way in the distance. Simple value, simple color, and really cool compared to foreground shadows, which are warmer. Again, it's the comparison that matters. This is in California, where Hanson Puthoff painted. And you can see the background mountains. Everything is enveloped in kind of blue, blue-violet. There's some warm areas because there's sunlight on the mountains, but it's a warm violet or warm blue-violet. And in the foreground sunlit areas, everything is a lot warmer. And it's that difference between the mountain color temperature and the grass color temperature that really separates and creates that depth in there. Then the shadows on these trees, a lot darker than the shadows back in here in the middle ground. And then these shadows back in here are a lot darker than the background mountains. So it's that, again, that difference between those three layers. You got foreground, middle ground, and background. And actually you got more layers back in here, but at least have three layers where you can separate and push the difference between the value. You have to simplify the shapes and then push the difference between them. If you're seeing too much detail, it won't work. You're not seeing big shapes. It's easier to separate big shapes from each other than a bunch of little detail. So stay away from the detail. You can always add a little at the end, but big shapes are easier to change. Again, focus on value relationships and color temperature, and we'll see you next time.